Dear Lord, I thank you for the opportunity for us to come together and to study your word. I pray that you will bless this time and that you will make the words that come from me constructive and helpful. And I pray that this will be a blessing to all of us here and a praise to you. In your son's name I pray, amen. Okay, well, it's been 2 weeks, but welcome back. We are doing a sort of brief pause before we start a larger study. And a while back, I was going through Malachi, and I made a kind of off comment about Isaiah 7, and Pastor Gary asked what my thoughts were on Isaiah 7, and I said, I'm not sure you want me to tell everyone what my thoughts were, and he's like, oh, no, go ahead and go through it. So that's what we're doing. We're going through Isaiah 7, particularly the Emmanuel prophecy. So 2 weeks ago, because we had a freeze last week, I sort of introduced everyone to the context, which should be fairly well known to everyone. But the Emmanuel prophecy is mainly famous because of Matthew's use of it. Right? He applies it specifically to Mary and Jesus. However, if we're just reading the story within its context, it's hard to jump to the very specific way that Matthew does, applying it to Jesus, applying it to Mary, to the virgin birth, and so on. And I know what the church fathers have said, and I know how we want to defend Matthew, but again, it's not necessarily as obvious within the story as you might think. We'll go through all of that, don't worry. And you can string me up. This is probably the most, or at least the closest view I have to outright heresy. I'm just letting you all know. I say that about 50-60% joking. There are probably some institutions and churches that would very much not be happy with me. This was a school presentation, and I had 2 professors yelling at me during the presentation. I went to DTS, fairly conservative school, so that just lets you all know. So the context of this is, of course, Isaiah 6, in the year that Uzziah died. Right, we have a time frame, roughly, so mid-8th century or so. We went over this last time. We went over Isaiah's calling and how we jump from the year Uzziah died to the reign of Ahaz a few years later. Ahaz, of course, is a real historic figure. This has been confirmed. And it's all within the context of the immediate invasion by the kings of Aram. They want Judah to help, Israel and Aram want Judah to help them fight off Assyria, and Judah doesn't want to do that. So they're threatening to invade them if they don't help. So Isaiah is sent to Ahaz to say, don't worry, the invasion's not going to work, and God's going to give you a sign that the invasion won't work. And then, of course, Ahaz goes, I don't need a sign. I don't want to test the Lord, which was the wrong choice. And so then Isaiah famously says, okay, then the Lord himself will give you a sign. Oh boy. And this verse is one of the most debated, one of the most just destroyed verses in all of the Old Testament. So just to give you a few examples, you don't know who these people are, it's fine, you don't have to know. John Skinner, who wrote a commentary, he goes so far as to claim that this is the most controversial passage in the entire Old Testament. That is a very impressive claim. Hans Wildberger says more commentary has been written on this one verse than any other single verse in the Old Testament. I don't know if that's true, but again, it's an impressive thing if it were. And then Brevard Childs, very famous theologian, he is arguably the last conservative theologian to teach at Yale. That's what he's famous for. He wrote that almost every word of this verse is controversial. I get it. You just want to hold your Bibles and love Jesus, but we're here to talk about this verse and everything that entails it. So I presented my paper after I got lambasted in class. I presented this at ETS, which is a conservative conference, and one of the things. So I'm presenting on this passage, and something I mentioned is that when we talk about this, usually what gets focused on is one of these 4 things. So the meaning of sign. The Lord will give you a sign. The meaning of Alma. What does the young woman mean? We will talk about that. The participles. There is no verb in this sentence. The participles bearing, and we'll get to that, the participles. And then finally, the name itself, Emmanuel. And then after I said these are the four things, right? If you ever hear someone talk about this, they're going to focus on these four things, except for me, because I'm crazy. And I said, I want to be very clear here. We're not talking about any of these. Now, in this there was like 6 people there, 3 older, probably professors, and then I had 3 young students sitting in the back. They're probably just students of the school. I presented this at New Orleans, by the way. And so I had what looked like 3 students sitting in the back, and I could just see the relief just hit all 3 of them, like at the same time. They're like, oh, thank God. Because they probably heard these presentations before. They've heard the same lectures. They've heard the same, they've heard the same horse getting beaten over and over and over again, and then we hear something different. So I'm like, we're not going to hit these. But for your sake, we're going to talk about why these are significant. Again, we're not focusing on any of these. But you have the issue with sign. So the question is, when the Bible says sign, does it mean miracle? Some say yes, it always means miracle. Some say no, it doesn't mean miracle. In fact, it very rarely means miracle. And then some says, well, the word's just symbolic, whatever that means. So the word sign is used in context of Sarah, it's used in context of Manoah's wife, and it's used in the context of Hannah. Now, Sarah and Hannah both have miraculous births, that's true, but it's also something fairly natural. Now, again, God helps them, but women becoming pregnant is not an unusual thing, right? Now, when we get to Mary, that is clearly something truly supernatural. But, again, is a woman getting pregnant necessarily a supernatural occurrence? Again, this is the debate. Do not yell at me. We're not getting into this. I don't care. The next issue is the meaning of young woman. And, of course, the problem is Matthew, when he translates it, uses a technical word for virgin. So the word here doesn't mean virgin. And my goodness, the theologians who just desperately want to die on this hill, it does not mean virgin. So what does the word mean? Okay, well, we'll go with their definition. It is a girl who has already gone through puberty. She is someone of marriageable age. She is not she's not a spinster yet, right? She's not an old maid. She is of prime marriage years, which puts her probably somewhere between 14 and, let's say, early 20s. She has never been married before, nor has she ever been pregnant. But it does not mean virgin. It means this. I think it's a ridiculous argument. So this is just imagine you're a dad and you're trying to arrange a wedding for your son. Your son's mid-20s or so. He's ready to get married. And so he's talking to a friend. He goes, hey, your daughter's about the age to get married. Would you like for her to marry my son? He's looking for an Alma. And the friend's like, yeah, sure, that'd be great. So everything happens, and they do the wedding feast. And then the son and the daughter, they're now married, and then they, have the wedding night. So then the next morning, the son comes out of the tent, and the dad's like, hey, how'd it go? And the son's like, well, and so they have a talk. And so then the dad goes to his friend and says, I have some concerns. I think that my son who married your daughter, and I was told she's an Alma, I don't think she was a virgin. And then, of course, the friend goes, well, you asked for an Alma. You didn't ask for a Betula. And then they laugh and laugh and laugh. No, there would be some concerns, right? If the girl is known to be promiscuous or is known that she's not a virgin, I don't think she would be called this, right? This is generally for an upstanding girl. We could talk about cultures and other things, but it's just funny to me that, okay, she's post-puberty, she's eligible for marriage, she's never been married, never been pregnant before, but we can't assume she's a virgin. And not only that, but again, the theologians who want to die on this hill, it just astonishes me. But we don't care about this. We're moving on. So then the next thing is there's no verb in this sentence. Every sentence needs a verb. It needs an action. You need a subject, you need an action, and then you need something that the action is doing. Otherwise, the sentence doesn't make sense. Now, you can have all three of those things appear in one word. I'm not going to give you an example, but it can be done. But again, you need those three things, unless you're Isaiah and you're writing this verse. So what you have here are two participles. Participles are verbal nouns. And I'm not going to give you a grammar lesson. But literally what is said is, if we wanted to translate this really, really literally, because you want to know what the Bible means, right? The Bible really says. It goes, so the young woman, the maiden, is conceiving and is birthing. And if you go, well, that's a little awkward. Yes, it is awkward. It's awkward in the Hebrew. It doesn't make any sense. Part of the problem with participles, and this is true of Hebrew, it's true of Greek, it's true of English, is participles are, by their very nature, non-temporal. So you don't have a time frame with them. So how do you get that? From the context, or more specifically, more preferably, is you would get it from the verb. There's a verb in the sentence. So if the verb is future, the participle is almost always future. If the verb is present, then the participle is present. If the verb is past, then the participle is past. What happens when there's no verb in the sentence? Well, there's no time. So the verb, the participle can take place whenever. And oh boy, do you have options. So you have the conception and delivery is future. She will become pregnant, she will give birth. The conception and delivery is present. This is ongoing. I always find it kind of an awkward option, but some do that. The conception and delivery was past. Presumably, you could make this argument that this has already happened. The child's already born. As far as I know, no one takes this option, but you could. And then you can argue that one is past and one is future, which theologians have argued for. Again, we don't care. We are moving on. The last one is Emmanuel. And this is probably more significant than you think. First of all, there's the question of how to even translate this. And translations are very subtle, but they always pick, they have to pick an option, right? So is it just God with us? And the argument is, by saying God with us, that is by nature incarnational language, that we should know by the name itself that we are talking about God being incarnate. That's a hard argument to make. I don't know if that makes you upset, but that's just my honest opinion. Then you have, of course, God is with us, which is just to be some indication of God's presence among his people. And then the last one can be something more petitionary, so may God be with us. All of these are valid options. And of course, then the question is, what is the nature of the name? First of all, could it just be a name? You go, well, the word God's in it, so it must be referring to God. Well, you've got Daniel, you have Ezekiel, you have Michael. None of those are incarnations of God. So just because El is in the name doesn't mean that this can't just be a name. You have the question of, does it by its very nature imply divinity? And of course, you have the question of, could this be a messianic title? Again, if this were any other person talking, he or she would focus on one of these 4 points and beat the horse until it no longer exists. But we have other fish to fry. So, moving on, the next thing, of course, is backgrounds, and this is something that I talked about last time, and that is between Isaiah's book and Matthew, we have almost no reference to this verse. It seems like the Jews overall just don't care about this passage. And this got one professor just so enraged. I'm like, how dare I say this? And it's like, I mean, it's true. What do you want me to say? Just lie to you? I mean, I think so. I think maybe he did. And he was so mad at me for putting this out. So, but honestly, I mean, that means that Matthew is really the first one to really pick up on this verse and to use it in a creative way. He's not being influenced by Jewish interpretation. This is a purely Christian interpretation. But for some reason, that gets people upset. Like, I don't know what to tell you. This is just, unless there's some book or whatever missing that we just haven't found, but this is, as it stands, the case. So now we get to my presentation. So I took all of this. I have worked it, and finally got it published. I'm quite proud of my title. It's based on the child's book, Are You My Mother? So I called it Are You My Alma? And the paper's focus, something that most people kind of overlook, which is because mostly we focus on who the child is, because we care about Jesus. We love Jesus. I get that. I understand. But it seems like the prophecy itself is about the mother. And it seems like the prophecy assumes we know who the mother is. It's talking about the Alma. Like the child, of course, is is coming out of it, right? But it seems like Isaiah expects us to know who the mother is and to care about the mother. But again, in most discussions, most presentations, they tend to ignore who the mother or just kind of overlook it in favor of who is the child. But I want to talk about the mother. And I got it published. I'm quite proud of that in the Criswell Journal. So, Criswell's also a fairly famous school, or not famous school, but rather a conservative school. So, I'm getting lambasted in my class at DTS, and then I get the Criswell Journal to publish. So I'm not sure where I fall. Am I a heretic? Am I not? I don't know. But part of the argument, and this is rather important for my argument, is that we understand just how many options there are when asked the question, who is the mother? I came up with 13. So if you're like, oh, it's just one or two, it's this or that, there are a lot more. And this isn't all of them. These are just the 13 most important ones that I think need to be talked about. And we're going to go through them. Don't you worry. Because this is important for my argument. And I think by the time we get to the end, you'll realize why this is important for my argument. So, because that's so many different possibilities, we're going to break them down into categories. So, the categories are, first, specific historical reference. By that I mean, when Isaiah gave the prophecy, he had in his mind an actual flesh and blood woman. He knew who he was talking about, and he expected his audience to know who he was talking about. He could have just pointed to her and said, that's the woman, and they all would have said, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. The second one is non-specific, meaning he may not have known. It's some idea, conceptualization of a woman. Like he had this vague idea, but he didn't know her name. The third one, I'm going to say figurative. Another word might be allegorical or typological or symbolic or whatever word helps you sleep at night. Non-literal. I know that's something we're scared of, and don't worry, we'll work through it. I'm here. This is a safe place. And then the last one is multi-fulfillment. That means that Isaiah was not locked into one specific answer. And this may seem like the safe answer. Like, well, yeah, this works. This makes sense. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And I'm going to go through why the multi-fulfillment views, I say views plural, don't actually work. So, we're going to begin. We'll start with the specific references. So, the first one, I'm pretty sure you're already familiar with, and that is Jesus, the Christological one. I kind of already buried the lead last time because I talked about this. So this view, of course, is that when Isaiah gave the prophecy, he had in his mind the vision of Mary. He knew who Mary was, he knew who Mary would be, he knew what she would do, and so he was already thinking into the future, and he had a vision of Mary, and he understood everything. This is basically the default position of the early church, and it's pretty much consistently the position of the church. We'll get to that in a second. And to this day, you do occasionally see theologians defend this. I think most of them tend to be more Catholic in nature, which shouldn't surprise us. Edward Young, a very conservative theologian, he defends this, or defend this. I don't know if he's still alive. But, it's not completely gone from our consciousness. It's just pretty rare. And that's because of Martin Luther. Oh, boy. He just ruins everything, doesn't he? Nailing things to doors and accusing the Pope of being the Antichrist and going against church interpretations. Yes, he did accuse the Pope of being the Antichrist. Oh boy, I love Martin Luther. So, this is the famous quote from one of his sermons. I do not know if this is the first time it was ever argued. What I do know, and I don't know if he's really the first one to point this out, but it's clear once he started kind of promoting this idea, it just kind of disappears, especially from Protestant commentaries, Protestant arguments. So he points out that prophecies like Isaiah 7:14 would not be understood as being about Christ if the gospel did not indicate them and point out Christ in them. So he's like, We know it's about Jesus because Matthew said it's about Jesus. But if Matthew never said it, would we have just assumed that this is about Jesus? I mean, it's a fair thing to argue. It's a fair thing to point out. And the fact that it's like just everyone just kind of jumps off the Christ train once he says all of this. Anyway. So the push then is, okay, if it's not about Christ, well then who is it about? And now the floodgates are open. So now we have all these new interpretations trying to answer the question, okay, if Isaiah wasn't thinking about Mary and Jesus, then who was he thinking about? And again, we have the same problem. We have a new problem, right? The problem is, if Isaiah wasn't thinking about Mary and Jesus, who was he thinking about? And also, how do we get to Mary and Jesus? Because Matthew makes it pretty clear that the prophecy was always about Mary and Jesus. So you see the problem. You see what Martin Luther did to us. This is all his fault. So, the second option is, I'm going to call it the Isaiah's son view. There's probably other terms for it. And this view is that Emmanuel is Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz. That's, I believe, the longest name in the Old Testament. This is, we could also call it the traditional Jewish view. This is what pretty much all the medieval Jewish rabbis said, because, of course, they're not going to say it was Jesus. Well, why not? Because they're Jewish. They're not Christian. Why would they agree that Isaiah is thinking about Christ when they don't believe that Christ is Christ? So this is what Rashi argued. This is what Ibn Ezra argues. And you even have a few Christian theologians who have picked up on this, such as Ronald Clements and John Oswalt. It doesn't work. Oh boy, doesn't it work. So, if we go on a little further, in Isaiah 8, 1 through 4, then the Lord said to me, so this is right after the prophecy, and the Lord said to me, take a large piece of parchment and write on it with an ordinary pen, Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz. I have appointed trustworthy witness, Uriah the priest and Zechariah, son of Jeberechiah. I was then intimate with the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. The Lord said to me, name him Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz. For before the boy knows how to call out father or mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoils of Samaria will be carried off to the king of Assyria. Boom! Check and mate. We had a prophecy of a child. We have a child. We have a prophecy about we're not going to be taken over by these invasions. We now have this child associated with the fulfillment of a prophecy. That's it. That was easy. No. So if we go back, the mother is the prophetess, right? Who's the prophetess? Because again, as I said, this whole thing is about who's the mother. Now, it's pretty universally accepted that the prophetess is Isaiah's wife. And as we already know, Isaiah's married. And as we already know, Isaiah already has a kid. So if this is, and when it says the prophetess, it is probably a way of saying Mrs. Prophet. So it's not, so it's, yeah, we'll just leave it at that. So if this is the definition, and as I've already said, theologians are going to die on this hill. This is the definition. We do not deviate from the definition. We do not question the definition. We must love the definition. Okay. The prophetess has already had a kid. So why would Isaiah refer to his own wife as an Alma if this is referring to a young woman who has never been married or ever had a kid before? Again, we don't have to argue or die on the hill of whether or not the word means virgin. It can't refer to someone who's already been married. It's never used that way. Another theologian's like, it doesn't mean virgin. Okay, fine, it doesn't mean virgin, but it can't refer to a woman who's been married. Now, so there is, of course, the option. So here are the problems. So first off, there's nothing in chapter 8 to suggest that this is someone other than his wife. We, of course, can get into specifics. The prophetess does not name the child. In the Emmanuel prophecy, it's the mother who names the child. The child is not named Emmanuel. That seems rather important. The child is named Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz. And even in the context, it's prophesied the child will be named Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz. What happened to the name Emmanuel? And now the workaround could be, well, this just isn't Isaiah's wife. I mean, I don't see that as an answer, though, because this just creates new problems. why is Isaiah sleeping around with random prophetesses? And that just kind of opens more cans of worms than we want to. So for most honest evangelical theologians, they'll be like, yeah, this view doesn't really work. I say most. So we're gonna X on this being Emmanuel, because again, it seems like we've discredited the prophetess as the mother if this is Isaiah's wife, which seems to be the common accepted view, especially among evangelicals. So the next one, we have the royal lineage view. And this view argues that Emmanuel is the son of the queen. So he's there before Isaiah, or he's there before Ahaz, and the queen is there, the court's there, and he's pointing to the royal queen. The royal queen would have been Abi. Abi would have been Hezekiah. Like, oh, we know Hezekiah. We like Hezekiah. Hezekiah is Emmanuel. That works. And this is very famously argued by Johannes Lindblom. Can anyone guess why this view doesn't work? What? So the first is, if he's pointing to the royal queen, well, she's already Mrs. King, right? She's already married. That's the first problem. Because again, that's the same problem as the prophetess. If this is Isaiah's wife, she wouldn't be called an Alma. Again, we don't have to die on the hill of whether or not it means virgin. It can't be someone already married. The other issue is, and this is just a tiny thing, it's so small, don't worry about it. I shouldn't even mention it, except Hezekiah was born 6 years ago. I mean, that seems like a minor detail, but to me, it's not a minor detail. So you've got problems. Like, if it's the queen, first of all, why doesn't he just say the queen's name? Especially if she's right there. Like, you, queen. You got the chronology problem. Hezekiah was already born. You've got, even if it's not Abi, you've got problems with if it's one of the king's concubines, she wouldn't be called an Alma. Because again, she's already connected to the king. It doesn't work. This doesn't work. I remember after I gave the presentation, I ran into one of my Old Testament professors, and I was telling him I was presenting this paper, and he goes, oh yeah, it's interesting, but it was clear that he wasn't really impressed with my view. We'll get to what my view is. And I said, well, okay, well then, who's the mother? And he goes, oh, it's the prophetess. And he just kind of says that, he just kind of shrugs, and then he starts to walk off. And I kid you not, I almost fell down laughing. He takes a few paces away, and then he stops. And he kind of turns to me and goes, well, maybe it's the queen. And then he just keeps on walking. He's like, well, which is it? Like, those are two completely different positions with completely different arguments, and they both have completely different reasons for why neither of them can work. They don't work. So then we have the fourth major view. This is the fourth one. And that is a woman of the royal court. This is famously argued by Theodore Lescaut. And in this one, this is a rather dramatic one. So in this, he's talking to Ahaz, and Ahaz is surrounded by some sort of entourage. And he's talking to Ahaz, and he points. He points to some random girl, and he goes, before she's going to get pregnant. Again, this is a very dramatic sort of thing, but the main argument against it is, if it's some random girl, then it's just some random girl, some random kid, then it kind of diminishes the importance of the prophecy. Because again, the context seems to be that we would know who the mother is, and we would care who the mother and child are. Again, if it's just some random girl, then what's the point? And how is that impressive at all? It's like, oh, just some random girl in the audience, she's going to get pregnant, and then that's going to prove. Again, it can somewhat establish a timeline. Well, she's going to get pregnant in the near future and have a kid, and then before a certain amount of time, then all this will happen. But how do you know? Like, how do you keep track of all of this? It seems like the prophecy is implying that the woman is someone famous, someone that we should know from the context of the story. That's my working hypothesis. And this is not a particularly popular view, but it is a view. Most commentaries, it is kind of funny, most conservative commentaries will either go with Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz or Hezekiah, and then they viciously argue with each other about why the other side doesn't work. Neither works. So then we have the non-historic referent views. Again, these are just non-specific women. So at least the random woman view, Hezekiah sees the woman, right? He can see her, he has a picture of her, he knows who it is, and he just kind of points to her. He may not even know who they are. So just to kind of blow through them, you've got a messianic view, you've got a deliverance view, you've got an eschatological view. In the messianic one, the Emmanuel figure is going to be this future king who's going to restore the Davidic dynasty. He might be in the near future. It's not clear because we don't know. And even Isaiah doesn't know who the woman is. He's just giving this very vague prophecy. The deliverance view is that the focus is on that this is going to be some sort of hero who's going to lead sort of a resurgence against the army. He's going to be this hero figure, not necessarily tied to the Davidic dynasty. And you got kind of an eschatological view that this figure is going to emerge and lead everyone back from the exile. First of all, but what does it have to do with the immediate context? How is this going to prove that they're going to be delivered from this invasion? But the two biggest problems that are kind of endemic to all of these views is, first of all, how does any of this affirm the historic fulfillment and the immediate fulfillment, which is what led us down this rabbit trail to begin with, because Martin Luther said, it can't just be some random thing referring to Christ. We need a historic fulfillment within the immediate time frame, because that's the point, right? Isaiah is giving this prophecy to Ahaz to confirm that this is all going to be fulfilled within the immediate future. Also, the prophecy is rather specific, right? We've got a woman, we've got a child, we have all this happening within a certain amount of time. All of these just kind of make it more vague and less specific, which seems to undercut what we're trying to do. The last one is rather inventive, and I guess it's impressive. This is, I'm going to call it the collective view. And this is that Isaiah is giving this prophecy. Again, there's like an entourage, so it's not just him and Ahaz. There's this court around them or whatever, and just everyone in the city, basically. They're in Jerusalem. Every young woman is going to get pregnant at the same time. Can't make that up. That's a view, and there are commentaries that advocate for this view. I guess it would be impressive, and just all the women just kind of miraculously, they're all pregnant around the exact same time, and they're all going to give birth around the same time. And there are a lot of problems with this view, but the main one, which is famously kind of pointed out, kind of poked fun at by Reverend Childs, again, he's that guy from Yale, is it's hard to argue for this when the prophecy seems to emphasize a singular woman, one woman, and a singular child. So if we're just talking about all the women of the city, then it kind of undermines the specifics again. So we've now, at least in my opinion, we've successfully kind of gone through the specific references as well as the non-specific references, and I don't find any of these all that convincing. Again, this is all assuming that Martin Luther was right in his initial criticisms of the Christological interpretation, which, to be honest, I'm kind of with him. It seems like Isaiah is expecting an immediate fulfillment that we just can't overlook anymore. Now, we're going to skip over the figurative ones and move on to the multi-fulfillment. Don't worry, we're going to get to the figurative ones. The first one is the dual fulfillment. So this isn't so much a view as it is kind of a hermeneutical Hail Mary, and I'm using that, yes, tongue-in-cheek. That the fulfillment, when Isaiah gave the prophecy, he always knew that there would be two fulfillments. So there was a historic fulfillment, and there would be a future fulfillment. So he knew. He knew there was going to be a woman and child in his time and a woman and child in the future with Mary. He may have even known about Mary and Jesus. There's still a problem with this view. It doesn't answer the question, who is the woman that's supposed to give birth in his own time? It's just sort of passing the buck. Well, again, there was one in his day and one in Matthew's day, and we'll just say that that's good enough. No, it's not good enough because you haven't answered the question yet. Also, and this is more specific, what in the prophecy leads us to believe that Isaiah was expecting two fulfillments? It seems like he's fairly confident there's going to be one fulfillment. So you're kind of pulling the second one out of the hat. The next view isn't really any better, and this, oddly enough, is Brever Child's view, although I found a New Testament scholar who kind of made the exact same argument and then claimed that no one else had come up with it before. That's always a very dangerous thing to claim that you're original or something, because very often you're not. But we could call this a progressive view, and this view basically argues that just prophecy by its very nature is not final. So you give a prophecy, and Isaiah would even know that when he gives a prophecy, yes, he expects a historic fulfillment, but he also knows that this could be applied to the future. So there could be multiple fulfillments. There's not just two, right? The dual is that there is just two. There's the one now, and then there's the final one. This one says there could be as many fulfillments as there needs to be. So there could be one now, there could be one in 100 years, 200 years, 300 years. Now, eventually, there will be a final one. So there was a woman and child in his day. Mary and Jesus is the final one, and then you could have 2, 3, 4, however, in the meantime. What's the problem? We still haven't answered the question, who's the historic woman and child? Oh, boy. Now, the next one is perhaps, I don't know, it might be the most creative of all of them. This is the dual prophecy view. And this is the view that the prophecy itself is not one prophecy, nor is it one prophecy with two fulfillments. It is, in fact, two prophecies with two fulfillments. Now, when I was a wee student, I was led to believe that this was the dispensational view. That's what it was just kind of jokingly called. It wasn't until I was digging into older commentaries and kind of digging into all of these views and kind of the history of these views that I came to realize, well, we'll get to that in a second. So the view says that between verses 14 and verses 16, the prophecy changes. So in verse 14, you have, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and name him Emmanuel. This is prophecy 1. This is prophecy 1. This prophecy refers to the future. This is referring to Christ. Now, it's not clear when the prophecy changes. So verse 15 is up for grabs. Because we have now, by the time he learns to reject what is bad and choose what is good, he will be eating butter and honey. So that verse, we're not sure. That could refer to Jesus, but it could refer to the other child. Now we go, for before the boy knows to reject what is bad and choose what is good, the land of the two kings you dread will be abandoned. The argument is that this line here, for before the boy, is referring to a different child. So we have two childs. And if you remember in the context, when Isaiah goes to talk to the king, he's got his kid with him. So the argument is that when he says, for before the boy, he turns and he points to the boy. I'm not making this up. This is the view. He points to the boy to let Ahaz know that we're talking about a different child. This view was proposed by John Calvin, which I think is kind of funny, yes. And in his commentary, he even says the line, here concerning verse 16, I differ from all commentators. He seems to know, I think he knew that this was a crackpot view. I think he knew it. But he's acknowledging, right? He acknowledges Martin Luther's criticism that the whole thing can't refer to Jesus. So he's trying to come up with a solution. But he still wants verse 14 to be about Jesus. So this is his solution. 14 is about Jesus, and 16 is about whoever the current, the child is in Isaiah's time. The problem, which should be painfully obvious, is that there is no indication whatsoever that we're dealing with two different prophecies. There's nothing in the text to say that Isaiah turned, that he pointed. There's nothing in the grammar to suggest anything has changed. So, this view just doesn't work. Okay, so we've gone through all of them. We've kind of blown through them a bit, but we're now getting to the good stuff. And this is part of the argument. Once you have exhausted, or done the best you can to exhaust all the normative, normal, literal, historical options, at some point you might need to look at some non-literal options. And again, at this point, I got my teachers just like seething mad. Like their faces are turning red, they're pounding their fists. It was a sight. It was impressive. So there are more than two kind of figurative options, but we're just going to focus on two. One is just fun to talk about. It's the mythological view. And this argues that within the culture, there was this sort of mythological, well, we'll just call it a myth. There was a myth that there was going to be this supernatural child who was a Messiah figure, basically. And that it may or may not have been sort of embellished or influenced by the surrounding cultures. But they had this myth of a messianic baby who was going to come and solve everyone's problems. And you can point to some verses to try and make this work. You got the Proto-Evangelion and so on. It's still kind of a weird view. And so when he's talking about this woman and child, he doesn't necessarily mean a physical woman and child. He doesn't mean a, actual flesh and blood baby. He's referring to this mythic child that may or may not come about sometime in the future. Now, we can apply that to Christ. It goes, okay, so he's appealing to this myth, thinking that there's going to be this Messiah at some point in the future. But again, it's really vague, and it's not a great view. And it's really difficult, right? It's difficult to verify that Isaiah's audience would have understood this in this sort of mythic, vague way. So it's not a great view. And not very many, especially evangelical scholars, commentaries and so forth, they just don't like this view. And I think for good reason. So without further ado, that leaves us to the last one. And this is obviously the one that I'm going to defend. This is popularly known as the daughter Zion view. This view argues that the Alma is Zion, the city. It is personified Zion, which we can metonymically equate with Israel. So Israel is the mother. The child, then, is the remnant. The problems, and these are, first of all, most commentaries do not even acknowledge this view's existence. They don't even want to talk about it, which makes researching it kind of difficult. But those that will, those that are brave enough to talk about it, there are two problems, and they keep coming up over and over and over again. The first one is literal views are better than allegorical ones. I completely agree. But what happens when you run out of literal views to argue about? At some point, you got to be honest and say, well, maybe we got to think outside the box. The second one is Delitzsch argues that virginity is never used of Zion. So Zion can't be the virgin. Well, I mean, we've already said that Alma doesn't mean virgin, but okay, fair enough. We can't apply this language specifically to Zion. And I like Delitzsch. He's a good conservative German. They do exist. He's just wrong on this. And I'll take you through why he's wrong. So, within the context, chapter 6 begins, of course, in the year that Uzziah dies. The godly king is dead and will be replaced by an ungodly one. However, Isaiah receives a vision of the heavenly throne, reaffirming Yahweh's sovereignty over the world. We then get the commissioning of Isaiah, and then we get content, destruction, exile, and return. So this is all what he's supposed to do. And then the message focuses on the messianic hope. There will be a remnant, and it will return to the land. As Childs explains, from the ashes of Israel's destruction, a new creation will emerge of God and his Messiah. So then we have the prophecy itself. The allied army of Rezin and Pekah is marching against Jerusalem. Aware of the invasion, King Ahaz and his court know that they do not have the power to resist. So Yahweh sends Isaiah and his son, Shir-Yashab. His name means a remnant will return. Because again, remnant is kind of an important theme in the book, just a little bit. To declare to Ahaz that God will defeat the invading armies for them, Yahweh offers Ahaz a choice. He can pick whatever sign he wants. However, Ahaz refuses to pick the sign, which results in a curse, right, a declaration of judgment. So this is directly from my article. Isaiah's chastisement seems to confirm that Ahaz chose poorly. It is noteworthy that Isaiah shifts from addressing Ahaz in the singular, The Lord spoke again to Ahaz, ask for a sign from the Lord your God, your being singular you. In English, we do not distinguish between singular you and plural you, but most languages do. It's helpful. So when I'm talking to you versus talking to you. In the singular to plural forms. Isaiah said, listen, house of David, is it not enough for y'all, which is how it should be translated, to try the patience of men? Will y'all also try the patience of my God? So imagine, right, I'm talking to Brother Gary, and I'm just like, yeah, you know what the problem is. It's y'all. So I'm shifting, right? I'm shifting from you singular to you plural to let everyone know you're all included in my rant. That's what Isaiah is doing here. He is changing. We actually have a grammatical change in the language to let us know that something has happened, as opposed to what Calvin said, right? He's like, well, there's a change. There's no change in the language. There's no change in the context. There's no change anywhere to indicate that what he wants to say. However, now there is, right? We actually have a change in the language. It appears that the prophet no longer addresses Ahaz the individual, but reprimands the royal household. Wildberger, you don't care who he is, takes us even further, noting Isaiah's language of my God. That he does not say our God seems to indicate a separation between Yahweh and Ahaz's house. I think it's a fair point. Also, Proksch states only a completely deluded exegesis would see anything but a threat to Ahaz in the words which follow. However, the question remains, how does the oracle relate to the household, and is hope implied? I just love that statement, right? It's just a deluded exegesis. So what is the sign of the prophecy? First is the reference to Alma, a mysterious figure who is never named in the prophecy. The argument that her identity is not important seems unconvincing. It does. It seems like we're supposed to know who this woman is. It seems like it's important, as well as the child. Isaiah is referring to an individual whose very existence is crucial for the people and their future. However, no female figure is directly or indirectly mentioned until the prophetess in 8:3, who we've already said doesn't really work because that's most likely Isaiah's wife, except for personified Zion. Daughter Zion is first mentioned in Isaiah 1:8. Daughter Zion is abandoned like a shelter in her vineyard, like a shack in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. And discussed in personified language in chapters 1, 3, later in 16, 37, 52, just a few places. Isaiah 37:22 even refers to the virgin daughter Zion. This is 37. Then Isaiah, son of Amos, in a message to Hezekiah, the Lord, the God of Israel, says, because you prayed to me about Sennacherib, king of Assyria, this is the word the Lord has spoken against him. Virgin daughter Zion despises you and scorns you. Daughter Jerusalem shakes her head behind your back. What did Delitzsch say again? That Zion is never called a virgin? Honestly, this is the verse that convinced me that this view's right. If we're looking for Alma, we're looking for a virgin in the story, and Isaiah straight up calls Zion the virgin. I mean, I feel like this is the nail in the coffin. But, you know, again, I'm the heretic, right? So, going on. The title Daughter Zion occurs in 1:8, 10:32, 16:1, 37:22, 52:2, 62:11, 83. In case you're concerned, like, well, is this a proto-Isaiah thing or a Deutero-Isaiah? It's everywhere. It's all throughout the book. Zion is further personified as the mother of God's people in chapter 3, 36, 38, 49, and repeatedly till the end of the book. So this is not like, well, she appears maybe once or twice. She appears everywhere, all throughout the book. Zion is further depicted as Yahweh's spouse, most famously in Isaiah 54, 57, 62. Again, Isaiah recognizes her as the virgin daughter in Isaiah 37, which you can compare to 2 Kings 19:21 and Amos 5:2, just in case you think this is just an Isaiah thing. It's not. So it seems reasonable to speculate that when Isaiah refers to the young woman, we may have a specific referent in mind, and that daughter Zion is a viable candidate. So if he's talking about an important woman or an important young woman, and he expects us, not only the audience, but the readers of the book, to know who he's talking about, and the one female figure who appears most repeatedly throughout the entire book is daughter Zion, there might be a connection. I know it's crazy, but maybe? it is not a stretch to say that personified Zion is a recurring character in Isaiah's sermons. This has given birth, pun intended, to the question, could Zion be the mother in 7:14? That the woman is described as Alma does not pose any exegetical or interpretive dilemma, since Zion, Israel, is often depicted in similar language. This is part of the fun of the metaphor, right? That Israel and Zion can both be described, sometimes within a few chapters of each other, as the pure virgin and the adulterous whore. And we can go back and forth because it's a metaphor. Zion, Israel, personified as the young woman who has never conceived before, will now become pregnant and bear a child. Compare Micah 4:10. Like, wow, but that's just crazy. That's crazy. Why would you ever make the assumption that Israel or Zion would go through pregnant? Oh, yeah, Micah. Writhe and cry out, daughter Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you will leave the city and camp in the open fields. This is not the only time that we see Israel used with pregnant language. Further, arguments have been made that the conception itself is not important, yet every detail of the prophecy seems to be vital. Her soon-to-be offspring will bear the name Emmanuel because her child will be a new people among whom God will dwell. This helps us better understand the judgment on Ahaz's house, since it will be replaced by a new people and a new Davidic dynasty. The language of the Messiah here is broad enough that it can be used for a specific individual or its representative. Therefore, the effect is not diminished if Emmanuel is intended to be the collective remnant personified. So when we're talking about the prophecy, right, the point is that Zion is going to become pregnant, right? And Emmanuel, the child, is going to be the remnant, the new people of God. This is not just a judgment on Ahaz. This is not just a judgment on the Davidic dynasty or the royal dynasty. This is a judgment on everyone, on the entire nation, that they have failed, but don't despair, because the nation is going to give birth to a new nation, a new people of God. The second issue deals with the approximate timeline. Isaiah's statement, he knows to reject evil and choose good, seems to give us the child's relative age. And this gets into a, oh boy, can of worms. So basically the question is, when is the age of accountability? Is it when they're still a baby? Is it when they're 3 or 4? Is it when they're 10 to 12? Is it when, I kid you not, 16 to 18, which seems a little old for me. I think kids probably figure it out earlier than we tend to expect. But if we're talking about a people, right, then this whole thing becomes more metaphorical. I don't want to use the A word. I don't call it allegory, but again, we're getting lost in specifics we're not supposed to be. Again, if this is metaphorical language, then the timetable becomes more flexible for precisely how long does it take for people to learn right from wrong. Some people never figure it out. The rest of the chapter foretells the coming Assyrian invasion, which will judge Aram and Ephraim along with Ahaz and Judah in the wake of this devastation. A promised remnant will be born and endure. As Skinner points out, Isaiah held to the belief that out of the immediate trial there would emerge a regenerate nation to enjoy the temporal and spiritual blessings of the Messianic age. So, we're kind of skipping through a bunch of stuff, but the point of my paper originally, right, was for a hermeneutics class. And the point of the hermeneutics class was to get to not so much what Isaiah, which is why I'm kind of still a little ticked off by the reception I got, because so far we're talking about what Isaiah meant. But the point of the paper was, what did Matthew think? Particularly, what was Matthew thinking? The point basically is, what did Matthew think Isaiah thought? Which is very hard to get into. So, what's looking back on it, what's particularly funny is I'm getting both these professors yelling and writhing at me because of what I think, because I was suggesting that Isaiah meant for this to be allegorically, which I'm using very loosely. But then I went further to say Matthew knew that. Matthew knew all along this was an allegory. And here's the funny thing. It just cracks me up. Both professors, who up to this point have been pounding their tables and yelling at me, once I said Matthew knew this was an allegory, 180. They're praising me. They loved everything I had to say about the New Testament. I still got a B on that paper, which I am still mad about. It did not deserve a B. So, no discussion on Isaiah 7:14 is complete without mentioning Matthew 1:23. And what is the oldest interpretation? Again, I got mad because I said this. I don't know why it's a problem. Matthew presents Isaiah's prophecy through the pregnancy of Mary, right? We all know the passage in Matthew. So Matthew's quotation is almost precisely what we find in the Greek, except for the translation. We have parthenos, which is virgin, which alma doesn't mean, means young woman, whatever. The only real significant change is in the pronoun. So in the Hebrew, it's she, right? In the Greek, it's you singular. And then Matthew has you plural. This is a minor deviation. Minor. It's as small as you're going to get. Okay, so the pronoun's being changed. And it's probably intentional for whatever reason. So when it comes to New Testament options, we have all kinds of, we've got, the New Testament scholars are all over the place. And it's particularly frustrating because it's like, do New Testament scholars ever read Old Testament commentaries? I have my doubts. It seems like they never do. So you've got all kinds of views, and you've got one guy who claims, like, I came up with a view no one ever thought of before, and it's like, Reverend Childs came up with this, who's a very famous theologian. So you've got some saying, well, of course it's Christological, some saying it's dual, some saying it's Isaiah's son, some saying it's royal, mythological, and so forth. We've gone through all these and why these all don't work. I have yet to see a single New Testament commentary pick up on the allegorical option. But I think that's probably more because this is such an obscure view. We just don't really see it, particularly in evangelical circles, that they're just not aware of it. So this shows that even New Testament exegetes have difficulty harmonizing Matthew's Christological interpretation with a historical, we mean literal, physical, fulfillment hermeneutic. However, there's a possibility that Isaiah did not intend a historical fulfillment to his prophecy, for which there are sufficient grounds, as brought up elsewhere. Furthermore, it is conceivable that Matthew knew this. So Matthew knew it was always meant to be allegorical. We're going to go a little over. I'm almost done. Let us assume that Isaiah meant for the young woman to be Israel and Emmanuel to be the remnant. Then let us assume that Matthew understood this. We're making a huge assumption. How would this affect Matthew's interpretation? Well, we can begin with, Matthew begins, right, his gospel with Jesus' genealogy. And I even went over Matthew's genealogy a few weeks ago. So he focuses on Abraham, David, the exilic period, and then Jesus. Oh, yeah, I do have it. Okay. So the genealogy not only establishes the royal lineage of Christ, but also recaps the entire history of Israel, beginning with Abraham. Matthew even provides a summary of Israel's history. Abraham to David, David to the exile, and exile to the Messiah. It concludes with Christ because Jesus is seen as the climax of the restoration of the nation of Israel from exile. When the narrative of Matthew's gospel begins, it focuses upon a single pure girl who will deliver God's child. We're going with the imagery, right? Matthew explains that this was so the prophecy could be fulfilled, and we take that to mean enacted, as though it had never happened before. And then we get to the issue of could there be one enactment or two enactments or multiple and so forth. But it could mean reenacted. And I'm quite pleased with this kind of twist of phrase. By this, we are re-witnessing a crucial moment in Israel's history unfold. The event, conception, pregnancy, birth, already happened in the past with Israel, that is, with daughter Zion, and the remnant. Now Mary is acting the role of personified Israel. Yet she is not Israel. Rather, she is Israel as she should have been, the holy maiden, the pure virgin who gives birth while retaining her purity, which was something conceptually improbable and physically impossible in Isaiah's day. Through Mary's role, Christ takes on dual roles. He is the remnant made flesh as well as the literal Son of God. As the perfect synchronization of these elements, he takes his place as the Messiah, who is simultaneously the remnant and its figurehead. As Davies and Allison explain, for Matthew, Son of God must have to do in part with Jesus as personification or embodiment of true obedient Israel. If God would call Israel his firstborn son, then how much more Jesus the Messiah? So this idea that Christ is the remnant is not new. I didn't come up with that. I'm just saying, what if that idea goes all the way back to Matthew's prophecy, or Matthew's interpretation of the prophecy? It is difficult to exaggerate the influence Isaiah wielded over Second Temple theology. This is no less true for the writers of the New Testament, in particular Matthew. And just going off of Isaiah is the second most quoted book in the New Testament, following Psalms. By focusing solely on Isaiah 7:14, we miss many of these other themes that run throughout Isaiah, not just Isaiah 7, that Matthew now sees converging on one person. Furthermore, it seems commonplace to find Matthew's use of Isaiah explained through some form of typology, whereby Isaiah's Emmanuel becomes a type that Christ fulfills through being its antitype. However, the proposed reenactment model offers a more precise explanation. Matthew is presenting Christ as the remnant, that would be the new Israel, incarnate. Christ's life is then a recounting of Israel's history. This also helps set up the theory of Christ's life as redeeming Israel's history. Now, this, again, is not original to me. In fact, there's a dissertation that came out right before I did this, who argues that Matthew, and even the way Matthew is writing his gospel, is intentionally writing it so that Christ's life mirrors the history of Israel. But he doesn't connect the Isaiah prophecy. So again, these are ideas that are all floating around in New Testament thought. I'm just saying, what if it also includes this one specific prophecy? So easily, the most, because it's not the Matthew 1:23 prophecy, the most difficult verse, probably, for Matthean scholars is Hosea. So in Matthew 2, you have, after they were gone, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, "Get up, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and escaped to Egypt. He stayed there until Herod's death, so that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled. "Out of Egypt I called my son." This verse haunts Matthean scholars' dreams. They do not know what to do with this verse. It does not make sense, and you can't, because this verse is not prophetic. It is never taken prophetically. Within the context, when Israel was called a child, I loved him out of Egypt to call my son. There's nothing in this passage to suggest this verse was meant to be a prophecy. So how can Matthew take it and apply it to Jesus? Because the assumption is he must be taking it prophetically, like he does with the Isaiah 7 verse. However, in the context of Hosea, the passage is about judgment and Israel's rejection of God. Here, however, the action may be the same, God reclaiming his son. But this is no longer the spoiled, rebellious Israel of Hosea's day. This is the true, obedient son. So, if we already see in Matthew's gospel the idea that Jesus is reliving the history of Israel, then this verse makes sense, because he's pulling verses that apply to Israel and wrapping it up in the Jesus narrative. So he's not applying it necessarily as a prophecy, but rather just a description of Israel. Just, this happened in Israel's history, and this is now happening in Christ's life. Another example. In those days, John the Baptist came preaching in the wilderness of Judea and saying, "Repent, because the kingdom of heaven has come near. For he is the one spoken of through the prophet Isaiah, who said, 'A voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight.'" Isaiah 43. "A voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." And Matthew 3:3. In Isaiah, this verse is in the context of the remnant's return from exile. So when we talk about Matthew 2 here, we often ignore the context of this verse. He's speaking of the remnant. And so now, John the Baptist is saying this prophecy has come true. But Isaiah is clear, it's about the remnant. It's not about the Christ, it's not about Messiah. But if Jesus is the remnant, now that makes sense. I think this is getting picked up on. I think scholars are now realizing, again, like all these things are kind of converging a bit, but it's like they don't know how to back up enough and include Matthew 1:23. Other examples of parallels, again, this is not original to me. Other scholars are picking up on this. So you have Herod killing the babies, which seems to mirror Pharaoh killing the babies. You have Joseph and Mary fleeing to Egypt. You have Jacob and Abraham and their families fleeing to Egypt. You have Jesus' baptism with the parting of the Red Sea. You have Jesus in the wilderness. You have Israel's wanderings. You have Sermon on the Mount, which parallels Moses giving the law at Sinai. You have the Gerasene demoniac, which is a parallel to Yahweh throwing Pharaoh's army into the sea. The language is even exactly the same. It's really impressive. And then, of course, you have the crucifixion, and you have the language of the conquest of Jerusalem. Jerusalem on the hill, the enemies look up, and so on. So that's it.
I was going to ask, how many people feel like their head is spinning now? You see, and I asked James to do this because there's nothing that he has said that is not reasonable. It just may not be the way that you or I view the Scripture. But to say that is just because we disagree or may not see things exactly the same, that's okay. Because we all have differences. Alyssa, my dear friend, we view things differently, but she's my dear friend. James is my dear friend. May not agree with everything he said, but that's okay because what we've done is be able to make us think about what we believe instead of just accepting something that we've always heard it to be. You know, it goes back to the old story about the little girl watching her mother cut the end off of a roast and saying, "Why did you do that?" "I don't know, go ask your grandmother." She goes, "Ask grandmother." "Why did you do that?" "Because your great-grandmother did that." "Go ask her." The little girl goes and says, "Great-grandmother, why'd you cut the end off the roast?" "Well, I did that because it wouldn't fit in my pot." You see, and so we just get to where we just see things one way. And I appreciate James bringing this, and it gives you something to think about. Now, to me, it's no surprise that the Jewish community wouldn't have saw that as prophetic because they missed a lot in the Old Testament. You know, they didn't see the suffering servant and the conquering hero Messiah as the same person. Some of them saw it's two different. So that doesn't surprise me at all. But I think what he said is interesting and, you know, something to think about. It may not change your view, but that's okay. He's not a heretic. He didn't say anything and didn't deny Scripture in any way. He just sees that portion in a little different light than you and I may see it. So it's okay, right? It's okay. We're not going to, you didn't start the bonfire, right, Randall, yet? You know, we're not going to tie you to a stake tonight, brother. It's okay. It's okay. But anyway, I enjoyed listening to you, brother. It kind of stretched my thinking a little bit. But anyway, is there anything else before we go? We'll pray and go. All right. If not, John, would you close us in prayer tonight, my brother?